There is a quiet moment when a person realizes that $10,000 don't feel like a financial goal. They feel like a wall. That's too high for someone who lives solving life 1 month at a time. And that thought doesn't come up because the person is bad with money. It comes up because they learned how to survive, not how to accumulate. And survival consumes everything that comes in before it even has a chance to become a balance. When you live counting the days until the next paycheck, $10,000 don't sound like a goal. They sound like something reserved for other people. People who earn more, who made fewer mistakes, who started earlier. And that comparison happens automatically without effort, as if the brain were trying to protect the person from frustration by saying that this number isn't for them. The problem is that this thought settles in early. And from that point on, every attempt to save already starts out tired. Because the mind doesn't see the goal as achievable, it sees it as too distant to justify the daily sacrifice. And when the goal feels distant, any effort feels pointless. Most people don't fail to save because they spend too much. They fail because they can't emotionally sustain the idea of setting money aside for a long time without seeing a clear result, and $10,000 don't appear quickly. They require consistency. And consistency is hard when your entire life has taught you that any unexpected event can erase weeks of effort. Every time someone tries to start saving and has to use the little they save to cover an unexpected expense, the mind records that as proof that saving doesn't work even when it worked exactly as it should. And that emotional record weighs more than any logical explanation. Over time, the brain learns not to create expectations because expectations create frustration, and then saving stops being a plan and becomes a vague idea, something that's always postponed. For when you earn more, when life calms down, when there's extra left over even knowing, deep down, that this moment never arrives on its own. That's when $10,000 become a symbol of social distance, not just financial distance. Because they don't represent just money, they represent stability, margin for error, power of choice. And when someone feels they don't have that, they start living in defensive mode, solving the present and ignoring the future. Not out of irresponsibility, but out of exhaustion. The brain prioritizes the short term when the long term feels unreachable. And this creates a silent cycle where the person works, pays bills, breathes a little easier for a few days, and then feels tension again without ever feeling like they're truly moving forward. And the cruelest part is that from the outside, it looks like a lack of organization, but on the inside, it's a lack of concrete hope, because no one truly commits to something they believe they want to achieve. And as long as $10,000 feel like an abstract number, distant from real life, any attempt to save will be fragile. There's also a dangerous illusion along this path. The idea that you need to earn more before you start, when in reality, the process of saving the first $10,000 doesn't start with hiring Kami. It starts with a change in the relationship with the money that comes in. And almost no one explains this change in a simple way. Saving the first $10,000 isn't about big cuts. It's not about turning your life upside down. It's about breaking a mental pattern built over years of living on the EGL pattern that teaches that every dollar already has an owner before it even arrives. As long as that pattern isn't broken, any increase in income disappears the same way the current paycheck does, because the mental structure stays the same, only with bigger numbers passing through it. That's why so many people earn more than before and still have no savings. Not because they don't know what to do, but because they never changed the way they decide the destination of their money the moment it arrives. And that's exactly where the game starts to change. The first 1,000 is the hardest, not because of the amount, but because of the meaning. Because it represents the first time money wasn't fully consumed by survival. And that messes with a person's identity, because they start to realize that maybe they aren't condemned to live on the edge forever. But this beginning comes with fear of needing to use it, fear of making a mistake, fear of going back to zero. And if this fear isn't understood, it turns into self-sabotage, abandonment, quiet, quitting. Saving the first 10,000 isn't a straight line. It's a process full of small, broken expectations. And those who don't understand this blame themselves, call themselves weak, when in reality they're just facing something they were never taught to face. What separates those who reach 10,000 from those who never do isn't extreme willpower, it's clarity. It's understanding that this number isn't the final goal. It's just a point where life starts to breathe a little better. Before that, everything feels urgent. Everything feels risky. Everything feels unstable. And after that, the same problems start to feel manageable. But no one gets there by accident. They get there because they built a system simple enough to work even in bad months. And it's exactly this system that almost no one shows, because it doesn't look glamorous. It doesn't look fast, but it's the only one that works for people living real life. The most common mistake when trying to save the first 10,000 isn't invisible expenses. It's in the automatic decisions that happen before the money is even perceived as something that can stay. Because in most lives, money comes in already mentally committed. Even before it hits the account, it already has an owner, a destination it's already emotionally spent. This happens because the mind has been trained for years to solve urgencies, not to create margin. And when the money arrives, the brain goes into default mode. Pay everything that's known, relieve immediate tension, eliminate nearby risks. And only afterward, if anything is left, think about the future. But almost nothing is ever left. And when something is left, it's too little to feel relevant. Saving the first 10,000 requires reversing this logic without causing panic, because any abrupt change triggers resistance, guilt, and a sense of deprivation. And when someone feels deprived, they can't sustain the behavior for long even knowing it's important. That's why most people start excited and quit quietly, not because they want to save, but because they tried to save the wrong way. They tried to take from money that was already emotionally committed instead of deciding the destination of the money before it gets absorbed by routine. The most important moment in saving isn't the end of the month. It's the moment the money arrives, because that's when the mind is still open to new decisions. And once that moment passes, the money stops being a tool and becomes just flow coming in and going out without leaving a trace. Those who manage to save the first 10,000 learn, often without realizing it, to treat savings like an invisible fixed expense, something that happens automatically, without emotional negotiation every month. Because negotiating with your own mind is exhausting. And when you're exhausted, the mind chooses the easiest path. When saving depends on willpower, it fails in bad months, tiring months, in months when something goes out of control. And those are exactly the months that teach the brain that saving doesn't work, creating a cycle of quitting that reinforces itself over time. There's also an important psychological detail that almost no one explains. The brain needs frequent signs of progress to keep investing energy in something, and 10,000 is too big a number to generate those signals on its own. So those who get there learn to break the journey into smaller milestones, not as cold financial goals, but as concrete proof that something is changing. The first 500, the first 1,000, the first 2,000 aren't just numbers. They're moments when the mind starts to accept the idea that money can stop, can stay, can accumulate. And each of these moments slightly reduces the constant sense of urgency. But along with progress comes fear, because the more the balance grows, the more the sense of responsibility grows. And if this fear isn't understood, it turns into rigidity, blocks decisions, creates unnecessary anxiety, and makes the person act as if they're always about to lose everything. This is where many people confuse discipline with suffering, thinking saving has to hurt to work, when in reality, what works is comfortable consistency, the kind that doesn't create internal revolt, the kind that doesn't require heroic sacrifices every month. Saving the first 10,000 isn't about cutting everything that brings pleasure. It's about removing leaks that don't generate real emotional value, expenses that relieve you for a few minutes and weigh on you for months. And this only becomes clear when someone starts observing their own behavior with less guilt and more curiosity. When guilt leaves the scene, decisions become smarter, because the mind stops defending itself and starts collaborating. And this is a major turning point, because until then, money was treated as a source of judgment. From that point on, it starts being treated as a tool. Another silent mistake is thinking the first 10,000 will change your life on their own, when in reality, what changes your life is what happens inside your head before and during the process. Because the number itself doesn't solve everything, but the clarity it builds changes how all other problems are faced. Those who reach this point realize it's not about never having problems again. It's about not panicking at every problem. It's about being able to think calmly, compare options, choose without desperation. And this ability starts long before the balance reaches 10,000. At a certain point, the money saved stops being just protection and starts becoming mental space to breathe, to plan, to say no when necessary. And this doesn't appear all at once. It appears gradually, almost unnoticed. But to get there, you have to cross the most ungrateful phase of the process, to phase where the effort seems greater than the result, where progress is still invisible to outsiders, and only those who understand what they're building manage to keep going. It's exactly in this phase that most people quit, not out of incapacity, but because they lack a simple system that works even when motivation disappears. And without that system, any plan becomes just an intention. Saving the first 10,000 doesn't require genius. It requires enough emotional structure not to quit when the initial enthusiasm fades. And that structure doesn't come ready-made, it's built little by little with repeated, small, consistent decisions. And when that structure starts to exist, something changes quietly. The person stops thinking about money all the time because it stops being a constant threat and becomes just a part of life, important but not dominant. There's a point when the person realizes that the biggest enemy of the first 10,000 isn't the big, obvious expense. It's the small, constant expense that seems harmless because it doesn't hurt in the moment, but it builds a silent drain that prevents any real accumulation. And as long as that drain isn't noticed, money never stays long enough to grow. Asterisk, there's a point when the person realizes that the biggest enemy of the first 10,000 isn't the big, obvious expense. It's the small, constant expense that seems harmless because it doesn't hurt in the moment, but it builds a silent drain that prevents any real accumulation. And as long as that drain isn't noticed, money never stays long enough to grow. Asterisk, these expenses don't draw attention because they're part of the routine. They seem normal, justifiable, deserved after exhausting days. And exactly because of that, they go unnoticed. They're not seen as financial choices, they're seen as part of life. And when something becomes part of life, it's rarely questioned. The problem isn't the isolated amount, it's the frequency, because the brain doesn't automatically add up small recurring losses. It only reacts to big impacts. And that creates the illusion that everything is under control, when in practice, money's always slipping away through small openings that are never closed. Saving the first 10,000 requires a different kind of attention, not obsessive monitoring, but clear awareness of where money is going without bringing real emotional return. Because it doesn't make sense to cut everything, it makes sense to cut what isn't serving any important role. When someone starts observing these patterns without guilt, something changes. Instead of feeling attacked, the mind feels in control. And control generates calm, and calm generates better decisions, including financial ones. Another critical point in this process is understanding that the first 10,000 aren't built only with good months. They're built mainly with bad months, the months when something goes off plan. When an unexpected expense shows up, when income fluctuates, and those are the months when the system needs to work. Because if it only works when everything is perfect, it's not a system, it's a hope. Many people abandon saving after a bad month because they interpret that deviation as failure, when in reality, that month was exactly the test. And the difference between those who get there and those who don't lies in how they interpret those moments. Those who get there understand that stepping back a little doesn't erase the path already walked. They understand that using part of what was saved doesn't invalidate the process. And most importantly, they understand that consistency doesn't mean never failing, it means always resuming. This shift in interpretation is fundamental, because while someone punishes themselves for every slip, money becomes a source of shame. And shame paralyzes it, pushes away. It creates avoidance. And when money is avoided, it's never truly organized. Saving the first 10,000 requires a more neutral relationship with your own financial behavior, a relationship with less emotional charge. Because too much emotion generates impulsive decisions, whether to spend or to cut in a radical, unsustainable way. There's also a moment when the balance starts growing enough to create a new temptation. The desire to use that money to fix something that isn't an emergency, something that's been bothering you for a long time. And that temptation arises because the brain wants immediate relief, even if it delays the bigger goal. This is where it becomes clear that saving isn't just about storing money, it's about learning to delay certain solutions to protect the bigger change that's happening. And that's not easy, because present discomfort always feels more urgent than future benefit. Those who reach 10,000 learn to differentiate discomfort from real risk. They learn that not everything that bothers them needs to be solved now, and that preserving the reserve is often the best decision, even when it doesn't bring immediate relief. Little by little, the money saved starts to change mental posture. Decisions become less reactive. Fear decreases, and something new emerges, the feeling that there's room to make mistakes. And that feeling changes everything, because making mistakes stops being an existential threat and becomes just part of life. This margin doesn't eliminate problems, but it completely changes how they're faced, because now there's time to think, to compare options, to not accept the first bad solution that shows up just to end the anxiety. Saving the first 10,000 doesn't turn someone into a different person, but it transforms how they see themselves. Because for the first time, there's concrete proof that it's possible to leave survival mode even if abundance hasn't arrived yet. And that proof is powerful, because it breaks an old belief, the belief that money never stays, never remains, never accumulates. And when that belief falls, others start falling with it, opening space for better decisions in the future. But before that, it's necessary to cross the quietest stretch of the path of one where no one applauds, no one notices, and progress happens too slowly to generate excitement. And it's exactly in this stretch that the simple system needs to hold everything together. Without a system, motivation runs out. Without motivation, saving stops. And when saving stops, the goal starts to feel distant again. And the cycle restarts exactly where it always was. That's why understanding this process before trying to accelerate makes all the difference. Because those who try to run without structure get tired quickly, and those who walk slowly with consistency go much farther than they imagine. There comes a moment when the saved balance starts to trigger something different, not excitement, not euphoria, but a new kind of internal silence. The silence where the mind stops spinning scenarios all the time. And it happens without warning, without a clear milestone. One day, the person just realizes they haven't thought about money for hours. And that's something that had never happened before. That silence doesn't come because problems ended. They still exist. Bills still arrive. Unexpected events are still possible. But now there's a fundamental difference. Problems stop feeling like immediate threats to survival and start being seen as situations that require decisions, not panic. This is a very important point because financial life doesn't improve when problems disappear. It improves when the mind can deal with them without collapsing. And this starts happening long before reaching 10,000. But it's only noticed when the contrast becomes clear. The person starts to notice they react differently, that they think before deciding, that they don't accept just any solution to end anxiety. And that changes everything. Because decisions made calmly cost less in the long run, even when they seem harder in the short term. At this stage, the saved money stops being just protection against emergencies and starts working as a filter that blocks bad decisions, motivated by haste, fear, or desperation. And that filter is worth more than any isolated number. This is also where a new feeling appears. Respect for your own effort, because every amount accumulated carries the memory of choices made when it would have been easier to spend. And that strengthens the identity of someone who can sustain difficult decisions without emotionally destroying themselves. Saving the first 10,000 doesn't just create a balance, it creates confidence. Not the empty confidence of motivational phrases, but practical confidence based on real evidence. Evidence that it's possible to follow a plan even when life doesn't cooperate. But this internal growth comes with a silent risk. The risk of relaxing too much, of thinking everything is under control now. And that's exactly why many people get close to 10,000 and then lose their way because they confuse initial stability with permanent stability. The human mind adapts quickly. What yesterday felt like huge relief today starts to feel normal. And when it becomes normal, care decreases, attention drops, and small deviations start to appear again, almost imperceptible but dangerous. Those who reach 10,000 learn to keep the basics working, even when the sense of urgency decreases. Because they understand the system doesn't exist only for bad months, it also exists to protect during good months, when the temptation to spend more shows up, disguised as deserving it. This is where it becomes clear that saving isn't an event, it's a sustained behavior, and that the goal of 10,000 isn't to stop there. It's to consolidate a different way of dealing with money, one that doesn't depend on constant suffering or obsessive control. As the balance approaches this number, something changes in how the future is perceived. It stops feeling like a vague threat and starts feeling like something that can be organized, planned, adjusted, and that removes a huge weight that many people carry without realizing it. The fear of making mistakes decreases, because mistakes stop being fatal. And this simple shift opens space for better choices in all areas of life, not just money, because the sense of margin spreads, bringing more calm, more clarity, and less reactivity. But getting here requires having crossed the most invisible part of the path apart, where there's no external validation, no applause, no social proof, just decisions repeated in silence. And that's the part that defines everything. Saving the first 10,000 isn't about extreme discipline. It's about building a mental and practical environment where the right decision is the easiest. One to maintain even when fatigue appears, even when motivation disappears, and when that environment exists, money stops being a constant enemy and becomes just a tool, important but finally under control. And that changes the relationship with work, with consumption, and with the future itself. This process doesn't transform life overnight, but it transforms how life is felt every day. Because living without the constant sense of urgency is something few people experience, and it completely changes the way of being. And when the 10,000 finally appear, they don't arrive as a prize. They arrive as confirmation of something bigger, the confirmation that the person is no longer trapped in the automatic cycle of money coming in and money going out without leaving a trace. When the path to 10,000 starts to feel shorter than it is long, something changes in how the person sees their own effort. Because the goal stops being a distant abstraction and becomes something concrete, measurable, almost tangible. And this closeness creates a new kind of responsibilities, no longer based on fear, but on awareness. At this stage, every financial decision carries less tension and more intention, because there's enough history to prove that small, repeated choices work, and that internal proof is worth more than any external advice. Because it doesn't depend on trusting anyone else, it depends only on personal experience. The saved money starts influencing choices beyond saving itself. It influences how you consume, how you accept commitments, how you deal with proposals, and even how you say no. Because when there's a reserve, saying no stops feeling dangerous. This is a deep change, because many bad decisions are made not out of desire, but out of fear of having no option. And when the sense of having options appears to then, if still limited behavior changes almost automatically. Saving the first 10,000 creates a healthy distance between impulse and action. And that distance is where better decisions are born. Decisions that don't need to be perfect, just less desperate. And that alone is enough to completely change financial direction over time. At this point, the person starts to realize that money doesn't need to be thought about all the time to be under control, because there's a system running in the background, silent, consistent, and when something works without requiring constant attention, it leaves room to live better. But it's exactly here that another silent challenge appears, not turning this progress into excessive rigidity, because the fear of losing what was conquered can create a new kind of prison, more subtle, but just as exhausting. Those who cross this phase learn that protecting progress doesn't mean living in a permanent state of alert. It means trusting the system that was built and adjusting when necessary, without panic, without guilt, without extreme decisions. Saving the first 10,000 teaches, something else spreadsheet teaches, that stability doesn't come from controlling everything. It comes from accepting that not everything will be controlled, but that now there's enough margin to deal with that. This acceptance deeply reduces anxiety, because the mind stops fighting reality and starts working with it. And when that happens, money stops being a central problem and becomes just one element of life. The initial goal was to save 10,000, but as you get closer to it, it becomes clear that the real gain was something else. Leaving reactive mode, stopping the constant firefighting, feeling that life is no longer always one step away from collapse. And this feeling doesn't depend on continuing to accumulate indefinitely. It depends on maintaining the solid base that was built, because it's this base that supports any future growth, big or small. Getting close to 10,000 doesn't mean everything is solved. It just means there's now enough solid ground to walk without the constant fear of falling. And that completely changes the experience of living. At this point, many people look back and realize it wasn't one big decision that changed everything. It was a sequence of small decisions, repeated when no one was watching, when there was no guarantee of quick reward. This realization strengthens something essential: patience, because it becomes clear that real progress is slow, silent, and cumulative, and trying to accelerate too much almost always destroys what's being built. Saving the first 10,000 doesn't create a perfect life, but it creates a life that's less chaotic, less anxious, more emotionally predictable. And that's something no amount of money buys instantly. And when this stability starts to exist, an inevitable question arises. If it was possible to get here, what else can be built from this point on, now that the base is no longer fragile? That question doesn't need to be answered now, because the most important thing has already been done. The cycle was broken. And the proof of that is right there, accumulated, visible, real. Saving the first 10,000 doesn't create a perfect life, but it creates a life that's less chaotic, less suffocating, less dominated by the constant sense of urgency. And that difference, for those who lived a long time on the edge, is enormous. Because living without the daily weight of fear is already a profound form of relief. Problems continue to exist. Bills keep arriving. Decisions still need to be made. But now they don't all arrive at the same time inside the head. They don't explode together. They don't freeze thinking because there's a minimal base that absorbs the emotional impact of things. This base changes how life is felt day to day because money stops being the center of everything and becomes just support important, but finally in the right place, not dominating every thought, every choice, every sleepless night. When the 10,000 finally appear, they don't arrive with fireworks. They don't arrive with a grand sense of victory. They arrive quietly, almost discreetly. And that's exactly what shows something truly changed, because now money no longer needs to prove anything. The amount saved doesn't represent wealth. It represents emotional stability. It represents margin. It represents the ability to make mistakes without collapsing, to solve things without desperation, to choose without fear. And that's something only those who went through the process truly understand. Actually, at this point, it becomes clear that the hardest part wasn't saving the money, it was changing how you think. While the money still didn't exist, it was continuing when it felt too slow. It was resisting the urge to quit in bad months. It was trusting a simple system when motivation disappeared. And this trust built along the way doesn't disappear afterward. It stays, it becomes a foundation for everything that comes next. Because anyone who managed to reach the first 10,000 knows they can repeat the process, adjust it, improve it, grow at their own pace. Life doesn't turn into something else overnight, but it stops feeling like an endless sequence of emergencies. And that change is deep, silent, and liberating. Because living without the constant feeling of being behind is already a huge victory. Saving the first 10,000 isn't about proving anything to anyone else. It's about proving to yourself that it's possible to leave survival mode even slowly, even with flaws, even without perfection, just with consistency. And if this path made sense up to here, if these ideas organize something inside your head, it's because this change doesn't start with the balance. It starts with how you see money and your own effort. If you made it this far, leave a like, because that really helps this content reach more people who are living exactly this quiet phase of financial life. Subscribe to the channel to keep following this kind of clear conversation without empty promises, without unnecessary complication talking about money the way it really affects life. And comment the word asterisk, base, asterisk, down below, so I know you watched until the end and that this content made sense to you.